Thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today. I'm Serafina Fong. I'm co-chair of the Government Attorneys Interest Group of the American Society of International Law, and I'm concurrently the treasurer of the Singapore branch of the International Law Association. The ASIL Government Attorneys Interest Group provides a forum for the discussion of international legal issues of particular interest to international lawyers or other foreign affairs professionals working for governments or international organizations. The Singapore branch of the International Law Association is a unique platform in Singapore where academics, private practitioners, and government officials come together with a focus on private and public international law issues. And we happen to be celebrating our 10th anniversary this year. If you're not currently a member of the ASIL Government Attorneys Interest Group or the Singapore branch of the International Law Association, I strongly encourage you to sign up and join us. On behalf of both the ASIL Government Attorneys Interest Group and the Singapore branch of the International Law Association, I'm proud to present the first of possibly many collabs and what we consider a very timely conversation on climate finance, turning COP29 pledges into action. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to our moderator, Yihong, and our esteemed speakers to kick off our webinar. Thank you.
Good evening, good morning, wherever around the globe you are logging in to join us from. I'm Yi Hong. I'm the Vice Chair of Programs of the ASIL Government Attorneys Interest Group, and I'll be moderating today's session. So today we're privileged to have with us two special guests to discuss climate finance. Let me first briefly introduce our speakers. First up, we have Bella Tonkanongi, who is the Senior Director of Programs at the Climate Policy Initiative based in the US. CPI for Climate Policy Initiative, or CPI for short, is an analysis and advisory organization with deep expertise in finance and policy. Bella guides and oversees the team's technical work in climate finance and leads external engagement and program development. Bella is a climate finance expert with more than 15 years' experience in domestic and international climate policy and finance. Next, we have Anshari Raman, who is Director of Policy and Analytics at Gen Zero and based in Singapore. Gen Zero is an investment platform company focused on accelerating decarbonization globally. Anshari is responsible for providing thought leadership on policy, regulations, and standards at Gen Zero. He was previously a climate change negotiator with Singapore's National Climate Change Secretariat under the Prime Minister's office, and has represented Singapore at various multilateral fora, including the UNFCCC and the IPCC. Thank you both for joining us today. Just to briefly introduce how we will be spending our session today, we will first be engaging both speakers in a discussion for the first 45 minutes that we have, and then we'll leave the last 15 minutes for a Q&A session. So to everyone in our audience, please type out any questions you may have on the chat, and we will pick them up afterwards towards the end of the session. So to kick us off, most of us would have read news headlines from most recent COP29 held in Baku, Azerbaijan in November last year. At COP29, developed countries pledged to commit US $300 billion annually by 2035 to support climate action by developing countries and potentially mobilizing up to a US 1.3 trillion in climate finance. Today, we hope the discussion can shed some light on how these pledges can be translated into action. So to start with a very basic question to address to both our speakers, what exactly is climate finance and what do we need to know about the climate finance landscape today? And I'll first turn to Bella to kick us off. Thank you, Bella.
Sure. Thank you, Ihong, and good evening, good morning to everybody. Thank you for joining, and especially to those for whom it's very late. So thank you so much for participating, and I hope we'll keep it entertaining enough. So let me share a few slides. These are the only slides I'll show today, but I really felt that kind of having some pictures that illustrate a bit more what we mean by climate finance and where we are today would be helpful to setting the stage for this call. So I'm going to go ahead and share. So we at CPI, we're a nonprofit, global nonprofit organization. We are focused on analysis and advisory as it relates to climate policy and finance. And we have offices globally, US, UK, Indonesia, India, South Africa, Brazil. And we've been around since 2009, and we have been doing since around then a project or publication called The Global Landscape of Climate Finance. And what this project and product does is really try to capture what is climate finance, how much climate finance is flowing around the world, where is it going, who's it going to, who is the source of that climate finance, and really give that picture over time about what we know about climate finance. So what do we know about climate finance? So this is investment that goes to renewable energy, energy efficiency, protecting forests, all the things that we think about climate change and both solving climate change and addressing the impacts of climate change. We try to capture that in our numbers. So what this graph shows is that those total investment flows around the world and how they've changed over time. So back in 2018, we were at 674 billion US dollars globally. And that has grown now to almost $1.5 trillion annually in 2022 and 2023, which is the last year for which we have data. We're actually going to be releasing new data in about a month's time. So what this shows is that flows have almost doubled in that time, which is a really positive story. But when we compare that to what models and scientists have shown we need in order to achieve global climate goals, notably maintaining temperatures at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is what we think about or what we talk about when we think about net zero by 2050. So what we see in this chart is that we are still far away from the kinds of investment flows we need to be at globally. So we're at 1.5 trillion. When we've looked at analyses and done our own analysis of where the needs are, we've come up with needs around $7 trillion annually. So that's a lot of money, and it's not, and I think that the thing to note about it's not that it's necessarily new money. A lot of it is shifting the flows of funding from let's say like dirtier options to cleaner options. I think the most easiest to understand there would be, instead of purchasing a gas or petrol powered car, you purchase an electric vehicle. Instead of heating our homes with gas or oil, we heat it with clean electricity. And so a lot of that gap is really about shifting demand towards cleaner products. So as part of that, we also talk about adaptation finance, and it's part of those total numbers. And what adaptation is about, it's about reducing the impacts that climate change is happening, both current impacts as well as projected future impacts. And of course, the less we do to reduce emissions, the more we need to think about adaptation, because the impacts will get worse over time. And so adaptation finance has grown similarly to mitigation finance over time, but it hasn't grown as swiftly. We're at about $76 billion annually, and where we need to be is closer to 200 or $240 billion annually. So these would be projects like stabilizing slopes so that there are fewer landslides as rainfall gets heavier and more frequent, or protecting mangroves, which again reduce flood risk on coasts. So let me just end with a couple slides just about the geographical distribution of climate change or climate finance specifically. So this chart on the left side, this box here, this is climate finance in 2018. And you can see that for advanced economies, climate finance in 2018 was the largest, followed by China, followed by emerging markets and developing economies, with relatively little for least developed countries and small island developing states. What this graph on the right shows is how those flows have changed over time. And the biggest story here is that China's growth in climate investments has increased substantially in that time by threefold. And investment in small island developing states is, also growing, but it's from a very small base. And so, as we think about, where is this climate investment going and where is it originating from? China and the advanced economies makes up the vast majority of all climate finance. And emerging markets and developing economies, and in particular, least developed countries, are far behind. And so a lot of the debates and discussions in climate finance around the world are really about how can we increase climate investment in total globally, but in particular, how do we get more of it going to emerging markets and developing economies? And so I think that's what I'm happy to talk about as we move forward in the discussion today. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to you, Ihong.
Thank you very much, Bella. I think that gave us a great overview, and I think I'll just give some time now to Anshari to share some observations he may have as well of the landscape and whether he wants to share anything specifically about the region we are from, Southeast Asia.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Yihong, and thanks, ASIL, for the invitation to speak. Great opening by Bella. Thank you. I'll come in with a bit more of a UNFCCC lens, given my background and where we see a lot of movement on climate finance. I think there's essentially two gaps that we need to address on climate finance, and Bella has kind of outlined some of these. One is the mismatch between what is being pledged. I'm speaking more to donor countries, developed countries, and what's actually disbursed to developing countries and how much they get. One of the key findings from the UNFCCC's recent climate finance flows report indicate at least between 2019 to 2020, the annual average climate finance flows was about 79 billion USD. Right. And there's also a mismatch between what's dispersed for mitigation and what's dispersed for adaptation. That's what Bella highlighted. And that's important, particularly as developing countries face increasing physical impacts of climate change. I think the finance flows for adaptation needs to be ramped up, and access and barriers to access this climate finance need to be removed. We fell short in terms of the 100 billion per annum climate pledges, climate target that was pledged previously. And in Baku, there was a groundbreaking target around 300 billion per annum in terms of climate finance. And I think it's quite timely that the global community look at what mechanisms can be utilized to deploy or facilitate the financial flows, leveraging both public coffers and also private sector. And I think the private sector aspect is going to be quite key in terms of unlocking climate finance. And I say this also in the context of today's geopolitical environment, where certain priorities for countries might shift given the geopolitical landscape and other imperatives, domestic imperatives. And so we need to be creative about how we can leverage some of these private sector finance. And I think carbon markets is one of them, right? How can carbon markets be an enabler to catalyze finance flows, particularly from private sector into mitigation solutions in developing countries. Um, you asked about potential in the region. Recently, we launched a report together with Bain, Temasek, Google, and Standard Chartered around the Southeast Asia and the broader Asia Pacific green economy opportunities. And I think the broad finding is that if we can successfully leverage system level solutions that utilize various innovative climate financing levers such as carbon markets and blended finance, we can actually close the gap in terms of the emissions gap in the region by about 50%, but also generates significant upside in terms of new jobs. So the paper found that about 900,000 new jobs in the green growth sector could be generated in Southeast Asia. There's a lot of potential and there's untapped potential in this region. For Southeast Asia alone, only about 3% of the total mitigation potential have been tapped through carbon markets, right? And there is a lot of attention in this region, and well-designed carbon markets can catalyze both private sector finance and potentially public sector demand for carbon credits and help channel carbon finance into much needed solutions, both on mitigation and also adaptation.
Great. Thank you, Anshari. Um, I think, I think that has given us a great overview of what we're talking about today. And before we jump into solutions, just want to delve a bit deeper into the gaps and the barriers that you've both raised. So I think what Bella was sharing just now about even though our financial flows have doubled, but it's still not meeting the needs that we have, both in terms of adaptation and especially in terms of adaptation. And Anshari also picked up that mismatch in pledges that have been made and what's actually dispersed. So I was wondering if you could both share more about what have been the barriers to ensuring these flows have been achieving the impacts that they are intended. So if
Yeah, I'm happy to start there. And certainly there are lots of barriers. There's been a lot of progress against those barriers, but many remain. And maybe it's thinking about sort of the supply and demand is helpful. So, for example, on the supply side, so both you can think about technology as well as finance there. So on the supply side, technology, the reason you see such a ramp up of climate investment has been in particular in the renewable energy space and the transport space. And that's from the very quick expansion of solar energy and of electric vehicles around the world. And so that's the positive story. I think where you see that climate investment hasn't ramped up has been in other sectors. So industry, for example, industrial decarbonization is the technologies are earlier stage. They require different policy tools to ramp up. We are seeing that sort of a more nascent climate approach or climate technologies, climate implementation. Agriculture, similar, very dispersed, let's say, users. You have technology that is available but not fully deployed, commercialized, and you have a lot of need for improvement, including in agricultural productivity in many places to reduce, say, pressures on deforestation. So it's helpful, I think, when you're thinking about the barriers to climate investment is breaking it down by sectors. Well, why haven't they progressed as quickly? I think there's a lot of barriers in policy. Certainly, governments that haven't implemented, say, like carbon pricing, for example, have a slower development and demand for technologies. I think carbon pricing, carbon markets are really important for that, and they have not been deployed as fully as we would like to see. And then, in developing countries in particular, there's barriers. One, and Shari mentioned it, that donors have um, not ramped up their financing to the levels that many had expected and hoped for. There are limitations or issues with the way that finance flows globally, and the difficulty accessing international finance that many developing countries have. And the list goes on a bit. I think with low-income countries, many are really experiencing quite significant levels of debt distress, and so they don't necessarily have the financing available for education and health, never mind for adaptation. And so there's quite a long list of barriers, I would say. And so this is where we really see it's very important to think about comprehensive approaches that really allow us to tackle many barriers over time.
I fully agree with Bella. Maybe I'll just go a bit deeper into carbon markets and where the barriers are. Conceptually, carbon markets is where you deploy capital most efficiently in delivering the abatement, where it's most cost effective, right? So per dollar, you could deliver significant abatement, particularly in developing economies where it's cheaper to decarbonize. That's the concept. And it does help improve economics for a lot of nascent solutions. In fact, I would attribute to the proliferation and adoption of renewables globally due to the market mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol era, under the Clean Development Mechanism. However, in practice, there's been a lot of bad actors in the carbon market, and therefore there's been confidence eroded in terms of the quality of and integrity of carbon markets more generally, both on the demand supply side and also on the transparency of the entire system. So right now, we are at an inflection point of carbon markets 2.0 following Paris Agreement, the decisions in Glasgow at COP21, and also more recently at COP26 last year in Baku. Where the rules are becoming clearer. There are more safeguards around the quality of the supply side. We need to ramp up on the demand, and I think the finance workflows. And I can speak to that a bit more later, but I think that's one of the key barriers today. I would also like to expand on what Bella mentioned about policy side. We as commercial investors, we are looking for policy clarity, predictability, and certainty when we make investments, because a lot of our investments in both tech and nature decarbonization solutions have long time horizons that straddle multiple governments, straddle multiple NDC periods. So we need to see that policy clarity and predictability. And the reality is that there's a lot of capacity building needs, particularly in developing countries, in understanding some of the complexities in the rules and how they can fully optimize the financing levers internationally, both blended finance but also carbon markets, to really deliver their climate objectives, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. My final point, and really again, I'm going to speak at length about carbon markets because this is where my expertise is. Carbon markets tend to be associated more with mitigation deliverables, but actually it can deliver a lot of adaptation co-benefits and co-benefits on social, but also biodiversity, water, positive outcomes, if designed well. And that's a big caveat there. In fact, a lot of the adaptation finance that came in the previous regime came from a share of proceeds from carbon markets that are channeled to the adaptation fund. So a levy was actually applied for every project, and this actually gets channeled into adaptation. So this is an example of where there are actually creative, innovative ways where we can utilize various financing levers and mechanisms out there to help and support developing countries, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation.
Thank you very much, both. I think we want to pick up now on developing countries, and I think you've both touched on them briefly, and we'll of course give Anshara a chance to go more into carbon credits and carbon markets later on. But maybe you can just share with us a bit more about what the key institutions and mechanisms currently supporting developing countries, and how do we see this developing further in terms of capacity building, technology transfers, what can be done to assist developing countries more?
I'm sorry, I've been going first a lot. Would you like to go first on
Yeah.
this one?
Yeah, I will caveat here. I'm not a climate finance expert, but I would say there are multiple platforms, at least on the UNFCCC's front and within the ecosystem that provide a lot of policy capacity building and support to developing countries in terms of policy design, um, formulating their climate obligations, whether it's the next nationally determined contribution, climate pledge, or some of their net zero long-term targets. And a lot of the multilateral development banks have different programs. So I think there's no shortage of platforms out there where developing countries can actually tap on. I think the key issue is to deliver what is tailored and potentially a bit more structured in terms of the specific needs of individual countries. Um, uh, at least on the carbon market side, one of my observation is that there's many one-on-one workshops, conferences, platforms to build capacity, but there is a bit of a workshop fatigue because everyone's attending the same thing and taking away the same findings, right? And they're talking about the same issues, one-on-one issues. I think we need to move beyond and put forward a bit more of a coherent and integrated approach at that's tailored to probably regions and then maybe countries based on specific needs. That's my key input here in terms of some of the platforms and levers for capacity building.
Yeah, I will just agree very much with that. That there's a lot of exhaustion about, a capacity building. And I think, I think we need to be doing more and kind of talking less about it. And so, one thing I think, so this year the COP is going to be in Brazil, COP 30, and they are really focusing on making this COP about implementation and delivery. And so, and I think one of the ways that developing countries have been really innovating in the space is through country platforms, which are really about organizing and building from the ground up investment plans and investable projects that then through this platform approach can attract investment from the various players in climate finance or development finance. So that can be domestic financial institutions, including commercial banks. It can be from international public finance institutions like the climate funds, like the Green Climate Fund, or the multilateral development banks like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank, and from domestic public finance. Many developing countries have national development banks and subnational development banks, and from international private finance. So, international banks, international pension funds. And so the idea of the country platforms is really to have a more coordinated approach to investment and to be able to execute sort of a package of both projects and policy reforms to be able to attract finance in a more coordinated manner. So South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, Senegal have been at the forefront of developing these platforms. And now this year at COP30, the hope and the expectation is that other countries will step forward and announce their own country platforms and really help to bring some coherence and some just focus on implementation, both to the developing countries themselves, as well as the many financial players, both public and private, in the space.
Thank you. Thank you both for speaking around that. Perhaps since you both picked up on this idea of capacity building and what exactly can be done in relation to that and at the country level. So what would your suggestions be on how this can be better structured to empower developing countries?
Okay, maybe I'll start. I think probably the processes need to be streamlined and the platforms need to be streamlined for developing countries to be able to access some of these resources a little bit easier. Bella has mentioned about some tailored country level platforms, and there are key actors, be it think tanks, and non-profits, MDBs, and UNFCCC more generally, and they have quite tailored programs. Uh, Actually, I think it also goes beyond the policymakers. To a certain extent, you need to build capacity even within the private sector, domestically, and the entire ecosystem. So it starts with the policymakers, but it does trickle down to the entire ecosystem within the country. And this is going to take a fairly monumental effort and different levers and different actors who can play the role. Um, uh, there is a way to potentially look at how clubs can be formed between like-minded countries, and we've seen that at least in carbon markets. So Africa, there's a club of Western African countries that come together to kind of align, both in terms of trying to understand the landscape, where they can access a lot of these investment opportunities, but also uh, develop policy coherence across the region and alignment, including with where the international demand and quality standards are, right? In this region, Southeast Asia, it's just starting, right? So at COP last year, the carbon market associations across 4 countries in this region came together to essentially look at tackling this streamlining and alignment, harmonization within the region. So probably that's an evolution beyond country level platforms to look at maybe regional, where you can aggregate some of these demand and also support platforms for countries that require somewhat similar or where they might benefit from many of these levers. And it allows investors like us to also come into one streamlined channel point of contact to access opportunities in the region.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure, I think that's absolutely right. And I think in particular, the need to kind of think regionally is really important. The only thing I'd add would be, around capacity for finance ministries. I think this is a really key place where capacity building, and I would say active capacity building, right? Like not just attending workshops, but really supporting finance ministries to develop their climate capabilities, to develop their modeling capabilities, to develop policy analysis, really active capacity building. The organization that's doing a lot of that is the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. The secretariat of that is run out of the World Bank, and really what they try to do, and they've developed this guidebook for finance ministries to be able to bring in more climate expertise and to develop more, whether it's through fiscal policy or through budgets or through investments. Every finance ministry has a different set of responsibilities. They're not all the same for sure, but to be able then to build the capacity to implement their work in a way that's, let's say, friendly or supportive of low carbon, climate resilient development, I think is a space where there's still a lot of need for capacity building.
Yeah, thanks for raising that, Bella. I fully echo. I think the finance ministries, finance ministers, particularly on the point you raised earlier around carbon pricing, there's a lot of scope and opportunities, particularly in this region. We are starting to see a bit of a proliferation of new carbon pricing schemes, whether it's carbon taxes or emissions trading schemes globally, right? But the price discovery is still at a very early stage and nascent stage. And it's not enough at this stage to accelerate capital flows into well-designed projects that are usually costly and demand a much higher carbon price. But fully agree. I think that's where the nub of the butt we need to kind of tackle. One of the key findings from a recent summit that we organized in Singapore is really around for the corporate side, we should stop talking to CSOs and talk to CFOs, right? On how actually climate investments can actually benefit them from a balance sheet standpoint, right? Why it's more important for them to prepare for a carbon constrained world of tomorrow, today, and start to plan for it now. Because what we are observing in this space, at least on the ESG and the corporate side, is that there's a bit of from greenwashing to green hushing, because everyone's just pulling back a little bit. But perhaps that's not the best strategy, given that things are going to move at least within this decade, and exposures will increase.
Yes, thank you both. I think that's a good segue that we have to speak more around carbon markets. And I think we are talking about more generally mobilizing the private sector. And at this juncture, I'll also just remind the audience that please feel free to post any questions that you have on the chat. We'll be picking up on them shortly. So maybe now turning to Anshari. So we have, and you also reference to them, these allegations of greenwashing and questions about the quality of carbon credits. So can you share what are some of the challenges that the voluntary carbon credit market is facing, and how do you see potential solutions to overcoming them?
Great, thanks. Allow me to go back maybe a few years, 2018. That's when the IPCC released the special report 1.5 degrees. And following the release of that report, we saw a suite of net zero pledges, both from corporates, but also countries, to align with the IPCC findings on how we should keep within a 1.5 degrees pathway, right? And many corporates, many companies actually make this pledge with a view that they can leverage the voluntary carbon market. Because it is going to be challenging, one, to effectively measure the entire carbon footprint across scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, but two, develop effective interventions to decarbonize to net zero just by direct abatement alone. So a lot of them make the pledge for net zero with a view that carbon markets can be a lever. Now, what happened subsequently was a lot of media scrutiny. Some are credible, some are headlines around the quality of both supply, that many of the carbon credits in the market today do not represent 1 ton of CO2 that's abated, whether it's reduced or removed, right? Because the methodologies or the counterfactuals are being inflated, or the baselines are being inflated. That's one main criticisms on the supply. Second is criticism on the demand, that it just enables corporates to purchase cheap offsets without actually undertaking direct mitigation action within their own value chain, right? And third is the opacity of the market itself, right? The carbon market is still in a very nascent stage. You don't really have price discovery, price transparency. Um, Today, on the supply side, it has vastly improved. So there are international initiatives and governance bodies that look at providing that benchmark quality because they scrutinize the governance of various crediting programs and they scrutinize the veracity of the methodologies under these programs. And this body is called the ICVCM, which stands for the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, which could change its name to verified because we are potentially looking at convergence between the voluntary and compliance. This is something that I will speak on later. Um, a lot of the crediting programs have new and improved methodologies taking into account the best available science today to improve precision of quantification of the emission reductions or removals. So there are new and improved methodologies that improve the quality and certainty of the abatement. And third, at every project level, there are now ratings firms that's new emerging solutions that came out probably in the past 2 to 3 years to look at individual projects that are registered and are issuing credits, and they make independent assessments on the risks of these projects actually delivering the abatement that they promise. And so they are rated much like financial markets. So we are starting to see the carbon market having some semblance of a maturity that will lend it towards a more financial markets where you can have a lot more scale and confidence in the supply side. Now, on the system side, exchanges do provide that price transparency and price discovery for a lot of the projects and carbon credits. And this can inform policymakers into how they want to structure policies on how they can benefit local communities and ensure that there's a revenue that comes back to the host countries. The issue that we need to tackle now is the demand, right? I think no one disagrees with the notion that you cannot just buy your way out through carbon offsets. You have to respect mitigation hierarchy and you need to decarbonize with your best effort directly within your value chain. Beyond which, if they are hard to abate emissions, then you should have the flexibility to use carbon credits. And there are net zero standards and bodies that look at the demand side, such as the Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative. But complexities aside, I think they provide that confidence on the demand and the claims. Um, Still nascent, so I think we're still waiting to see how this gets traction. But the demand side is quite important for us now to solve this final bit on the voluntary carbon market. I mentioned you spoke about the voluntary carbon market and distinction with compliance, and allow me to go into a bit of a technicality here around Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which recognizes that countries can effectively use market-based mechanisms to achieve their NDCs. That is in the context of international compliance under Paris Agreement. For voluntary carbon market, when corporates use carbon credits towards their voluntary climate target, in my view, this does contribute to the $300 billion climate finance target, right? Because it benefits both the host country and it channels investments and finance into projects within that host country. Article 6, not so much because the host country need to do adjustments to its inventory to avoid double counting with another country that's actually using the credits. But voluntary carbon market can provide that lever and you can actually deploy it fairly fast. And it's a very efficient way to channel private sector investment, but you need to unlock the demand. And I think there is a group of countries that are coming together and this was just announced, I think, yesterday, led by the UK, Kenya, and Singapore to look at how they can come in to provide that oversight on carbon markets effectively to provide more confidence that corporates can use high quality carbon credits, but with high quality claims also. So those are some of the positive developments today. Time will tell whether this will be effective and this can effectively channel climate finance towards much needed nascent solutions, but also cost effective solutions in developing countries. Yeah, Bella, I'm not sure whether you've got.
Oh no, I've just learned a lot about carbon markets, so I appreciate that, Anshari. No, I think I'm good, Yihong. If you want, I know there are a couple of questions from the audience, so I'm happy to move to that.
Yeah, perhaps before we open, I just also wanted to give Bella a chance to speak about. I understand that the Global Innovation Lab that you lead does look also around financial tools and solutions that can close the climate finance gap. So I was wondering whether you wanted to share some innovations that you've seen that have been effective and what we can learn from them.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to. So, we manage something called the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance. It's a public-private partnership. The members are mostly public and private financial institutions. We focus on incubating climate finance products and solutions that are aimed at emerging markets and developing economies. And we run sort of a global program. And then we also have programs in Brazil, in Southern and East Africa, in Latin America, in India, and then a new one in the Philippines, which is mostly focused on nature. And so what we do is we work with entrepreneurs who apply from wherever they are in the world with ideas that they want to develop out and test and validate with investors, and then they, by the end of the process, they're sort of ready to pitch and go raise funding. So we've been doing this now for 10 years. We've worked with more than 70 teams in the lab, and those teams have gone on to mobilize more than $4 billion of investment. So it's been a fairly successful program. We entrepreneurs have worked in many sectors. What we really focus is on innovative solutions for financing. So it could be a fund that, so for example, we've worked with the first fund that is investing in growth equity for adaptation companies. We've worked with regenerative agriculture facilities and funds in Brazil. We've worked on mangrove restoration in India. So it's a wide variety of solutions, and really driven by demand and need, and whether or not these entrepreneurs are kind of coming with concepts that can raise money and be financially sustainable over time. So it's been quite an exciting initiative. Really has helped to mobilize and helped us understand blended finance and understand kind of what works, where the challenges are, and how to overcome them. And to what Anshar was saying, a lot of the ideas come in with some sort of some thesis around the carbon markets. Some of them are fully about getting revenue from the carbon markets. A lot of them see it as part of the revenue base. So most will say they won't necessarily rely on the carbon markets to make their business model work, but the carbon markets will help them to make the business that much more sustainable and that much more profitable, and really help them kind of get over the hurdle of investability. So that's how a lot of the more successful ones really think about carbon markets.
Maybe I'd just like to add, I think it's a great conversation because actually, Bella, a lot of the jurisdictions that you mentioned are countries where we have projects and investments in India, Philippines. For us as investors, we actually look to partner thought leaders like CPI, right? Where you've got, you are actually supporting the policymakers in terms of their policy designs. Again, I have to repeat what I mentioned earlier. We are looking for policy clarity, predictability, and certainty where we make investments. And I think where we can work together as a community is where we can look at different aspects of the gaps. We can come in on the financing bit, you can look at the policy bit, and there's actually a lot of synergies, whether it's organic or we concerted effort to kind of work together in targeted countries. But yeah, that's great. We've got exposures in both developed and developing economies, and a lot of the lessons that we get from the developed countries in developed markets are actually quite useful in terms of supporting some of our investment thesis for a lot of our projects in the global south. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much to Anshar and Bella for bringing us through some of the solutions that we are seeing in place today and some thoughts about how they can develop in the future. So I think we will now turn to the questions and questions that we have from the chat. And I think we'll start with a question about whether it's realistic to aim for more than 7 trillion US dollars in climate change finance. Is it actually achievable given the current environmental backsliding? And what measures should be taken to maximize the chances of success? So I think this is also related to another question the team had, which was about in this environment of the global crises and environmental backsliding, as the audience have phrased it. What are your thoughts about how climate finance will develop? Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So for us, one, I think the narrative needs to change. In the past, we used to say you need to deploy renewables because it's good for the environment, it helps with climate change. Actually, today, you need to deploy renewables because it works towards your energy security objectives, and it's actually cheaper to do so. So you have to develop a business case for a lot of the climate investments, and that narrative is absolutely important to change. I spoke at length about carbon markets. Bella spoke about carbon pricing. The reality is that there will be proliferation of carbon pricing globally in various jurisdictions, and corporates will have exposure to compliance scheme, like it or not, whether it's CBAM, whether it's the EU ETS, or various carbon pricing schemes in the region, right? So companies need to be prepared for this exposure in future, and it's best to take steps today and understand where the market is, and introduce even shadow pricing, internal carbon price within your business case to prepare for such futures. I to the question, I would demur on whether 7 trillion is realistic or not. It's based on what the needs are to avert climate risk and deliver net zero, right? So how we deliver that, it's up to us as a global community. Or whether we tap on government coffers or we leverage private sector finance, concessionary capital, philanthropic. There are various ways where we can leverage finance internationally. I will also say that one of the things that I took away from some of the recent conversations in the past couple of months, yes, there is this perceived notion that there is some backsliding in terms of ESG commitments, climate commitments from corporates, maybe from countries, but there are bright sparks. Some countries have continued to submit their new post-2030 NDCs recently, right, amidst the broader environment. So it's quite encouraging. On the corporate side, what we are observing in reality is also maybe not so much evangelizing of their climate efforts or climate investments, but there are things that are being done quietly. So I think this will continue, particularly given many are taking a fairly long-term view in terms of their risk exposure to climate. Thanks.
Yeah, I thought that was very well answered. I think I've been heartened to see in the last few months many countries kind of doubling down on climate and their climate ambitions, and many investors, and I think Singapore is really showing a significant amount of leadership in this space at the moment, and it's very much welcome. Because I think, most of the world, and I would say many in the United States as well, really see climate as a major risk going forward, and also as a major economic opportunity. and that I think is, that's what's going to drive investment to the levels that will be needed. I mean, whether or not we get to 7 trillion, anybody's guess, but I think what we need to do is see that as the North Star and really work towards understanding the barriers and developing solutions to address them. And I, for one, am optimistic. I think that there's a lot, as Anshari said, a lot of bright spots here, and I've been really heartened to see how many countries have really kept up the focus, how the multilateral development banks continue to work in climate and focus on climate, and many countries. So I think there's a lot of reason for optimism.
Bella, just to pick up on the US, because we do have a more specific question from the audience about the US and about with the current US government administration stance on climate change more generally. Is there support in the US NGOs, commercial banks, or private sector more generally who'll be able to step up and make up for what the administration lacks?
Yeah, I guess if you couch it globally, so most US investment goes to the US. The US international investment, so the public climate finance, it was a chunk. I think last year it was around $11 billion in the last year of the Biden administration. That's really important, right? Like that's important for developing countries. It's important for institutions like the Green Climate Fund, who will no longer receive funding from the United States. It's important as a signal for multilateral development banks to do more in climate. And so, USAID was an incredibly important institution, both in supporting climate, but I think in particular in supporting the most vulnerable, poorest populations around the world, many of whom are reliant on subsistence agriculture, which is extremely exposed to increasing climate impacts. And so I think it's, first thing to say is that the reversal in US leadership in this space does matter. And it will have impacts. That said, I think there are opportunities for others like foundations in the US to step up. The Gates Foundation is increasing its investment. Overall, I think I'm hopeful that we'll see more and more foundations kind of really rethink their strategies and really announce more support. And we've seen other countries really stepping up and not necessarily filling all the gaps, but at least trying to strategically make sure that the most important priorities are funded to the extent possible. So and ultimately most investment, climate investment, is going to come, one, from the private sector, and two, domestically. And so maybe the other trend to think about is for developing countries, really a nudge, whether welcome or not, that they will have to work more towards mobilizing and developing out their domestic financial markets and their ability to invest in climate solutions domestically. That is easier for emerging markets than it is for low-income countries. But I think we will see more action in that direction, and hopefully, through these country platforms and others, the remaining donors, let's say, can be more coordinated and more efficient and make better use of their resources. Fewer workshops, more action, let's say.
Seconded.
Thank you. I do think we have run out on our time, so it really leaves me to thank our two speakers very much for joining us this morning and this evening, for Bella and Anshari to be with us today, to give us such a comprehensive overview of climate finance for especially many of us in the audience who may not be so familiar with this space. I think it was a great introduction to the trends that we should be looking out for and what can be done better. And I think the last line that was just said by Bella about more action and less talk. So we definitely hope that we can continue to see more hopeful developments in this space. And with that, thank you very much to ASIL for supporting this webinar tonight, and to the team from the ASIL Government Attorneys Interest Group who set up this meeting, as well as the ILA Singapore branch. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.